Nobody warns the empath about what comes after. Everyone talks about the awakening itself, the crisis, the dark night, the moment everything falls apart. But what Jung found most fascinating wasn't the breakdown. It was what walked out the other side. Because the person who emerges after a genuine spiritual awakening bears so little resemblance to who they were before, that even the people closest to them can't recognize what they're looking at. And what disturbed Jung most was that the transformation wasn't what anyone expected. The empath didn't become more empathic. They became something else entirely. Something that looks cold to people who knew the old version. Something that looks powerful to people encountering the new version for the first time. And something that feels like coming home to the empath themselves. Jung documented this transformation across decades of clinical work. He watched empaths enter his practice shattered, overwhelmed by everyone's emotions, unable to distinguish their own feelings from the feelings they absorbed, giving themselves away in every relationship until there was nothing left. And then he watched what happened when these same empaths went through genuine psychological awakening. Not the Instagram version. Not the version where you meditate for 30 days and feel peaceful. The real version, where your entire identity structure collapses and you have to rebuild from the foundation. What emerged from that collapse was consistent enough that Jung could map it. The empath who survived genuine awakening developed specific psychological characteristics that were so different from their previous state that Jung initially struggled to categorize what he was seeing. They weren't just healed empaths. They were a fundamentally different kind of person. Today I'm going to show you exactly what empaths become after genuine spiritual awakening, according to Jung's clinical observations, why this transformation terrifies almost everyone in the empath's life, and why the person you're becoming, if you're in the middle of this right now, is not a loss of who you were, but the arrival of who you were supposed to be all along. To understand the transformation, you have to understand what the empath was before awakening. Jung saw unawakened empaths as people living inside out. Their entire psychological orientation pointed outward. They monitored everyone else's emotional state while ignoring their own. They built their identity around being needed, being helpful, being the one who understood. Their sense of self wasn't generated internally. It was assembled from reflections in other people's responses to them. If you needed them, they existed. If you validated them, they had worth. If you were in pain, they had purpose. This isn't sensitivity. Jung recognized it as a sophisticated survival architecture built in childhood. The empath learned early that their safety depended on managing other people's emotional states. So, they developed extraordinary perceptual abilities, reading micro-expressions, sensing energetic shifts, detecting emotional undercurrents before anyone else noticed them. These abilities were real and powerful, but they were pointed in the wrong direction. Every ounce of that perceptual power was aimed outward at other people, leaving the empath's own inner world completely uncharted territory. Jung called this the extroverted wound. Not extroversion in the social sense, but a psychological wound that forced all awareness outward. The empath couldn't sit with their own emotions because they'd never learned how. They couldn't identify their own needs because their entire system was calibrated to identify everyone else's needs. They couldn't set boundaries because the concept of having a separate self-worth protecting had never been established. This is the person who enters awakening, and what happens to them is not gentle. Jung observed that genuine awakening for empaths begins when the outward-pointing system catastrophically fails. Usually this happens through a relationship or situation so devastating that the empath's usual strategies of absorbing, fixing, and accommodating simply cannot work anymore. The narcissistic partner who cannot be healed through love. The family system that punishes every attempt at connection. The friendship where giving everything yields nothing. Something breaks the empath's fundamental belief that if they just love hard enough, feel deeply enough, sacrifice completely enough, everything will be okay. When that belief breaks, the empath's entire operating system crashes. And this is where Jung observed the transformation beginning. Not in the crash itself, but in what the empath is forced to do during the crash. Turn their extraordinary perceptual abilities inward for the first time. The empath who spent 30 years reading everyone else's emotional landscape suddenly has to read their own. And what they find there is devastating. Decades of unfelt grief, rage they didn't know they were carrying, needs they never acknowledged, an entire inner world that's been neglected while they tended to everyone else's. Jung described this as the shadow confrontation. And for empaths, it's particularly brutal because their shadow isn't just personal darkness. It's every emotion they absorbed from others that was never processed. Every boundary they should have set but didn't. Every moment they betrayed themselves to keep someone else comfortable. This is the part of awakening that looks like falling apart. The empath may withdraw from relationships. They may stop answering calls. They may seem selfish or cold to people who are used to unlimited access. But what's actually happening is the most important psychological work of their life. They're finally meeting themselves. And the meeting is overwhelming because there's so much accumulated material to process. Jung was clear that this phase cannot be rushed or bypassed. The empath has to sit with their own pain the way they've sat with everyone else's pain for years. They have to give themselves the same compassion they've been pouring into others. They have to grieve the years they lost to other people's emergencies while their own life went unattended. This is agonizing work, but it's the only path to what comes next. What comes next is the transformation, and Jung documented it with the precision of someone watching a species evolve in real time. The empath who emerges from genuine awakening possesses their original abilities, but operating in a completely different configuration. Everything that was pointed outward now has an inward anchor. Everything that was used for survival now serves sovereignty. The same perceptual equipment exists, but the person wielding it has fundamentally changed. The first thing Jung observed was the development of what he called selective permeability. Before awakening, the empath was an open system. Everything came in, nothing was filtered. After awakening, the empath develops the ability to choose what they let in and what they keep out. They still perceive emotions, energies, and undercurrents, but they no longer automatically absorb them. It's the difference between standing in a rainstorm with no umbrella and standing in a rainstorm with the ability to decide which drops you let touch you. This doesn't look like building walls. It looks like developing a membrane, something alive and responsive that opens to what's nourishing and closes to what's toxic. Jung noticed that awakened empaths could sit with someone in genuine pain and offer profound presence without taking that pain home with them. They could perceive someone's manipulation without being hooked by it. They could sense a room's emotional atmosphere without being drowned by it. The perception remained. The absorption stopped. People who knew the old empath often interpret this as the empath becoming cold or uncaring. They're used to the version who absorbed everything, who was always available, who could be counted on to carry emotional weight that wasn't theirs. When that version disappears, it feels like abandonment to the people who depended on the old system. But Jung recognized it as the empath finally becoming healthy. The old absorption wasn't compassion. It was a trauma response masquerading as love. The second transformation Jung documented was the reversal of the helping pattern. Before awakening, empaths helped compulsively. They couldn't encounter pain without trying to fix it. They couldn't see someone struggling without intervening. This looked generous, but Jung identified it as a defense mechanism. Compulsive helping allowed the empath to avoid their own pain by constantly attending to everyone else's. As long as someone needed them, they didn't have to face the terrifying emptiness of their own unmet needs. After awakening, the compulsion dissolves. The empath can witness someone's pain without feeling responsible for resolving it. They can sit with suffering, their own and others, without needing to immediately make it better. This capacity to tolerate pain without fixing it is something Jung considered a mark of genuine psychological maturity. It means the empath has stopped using other people's problems as a distraction from their own inner work. But the awakened empath doesn't stop helping entirely. What changes is the motivation. Before, helping was driven by need, the need to feel worthy, to feel safe, to feel like they had a reason to exist. After awakening, helping becomes a choice made from fullness rather than emptiness. The empath helps when they genuinely want to, when the situation actually calls for their involvement, and when they can offer something without depleting themselves. This selective engagement is far more effective than the old pattern of indiscriminate giving, because help offered from wholeness actually helps. Help offered from desperation just creates codependence. Before we continue, check out our new guide, True Self-Discovery, with 24 practical reflection exercises inspired by the teachings of Carl Jung, designed to help you find your way within. Click below to get True Self-Discovery. The third transformation Jung found was perhaps the most startling to outside observers. The awakened empath develops what he called integrated authority. Before awakening, empaths were often passive, accommodating, conflict avoidant. They'd swallow their truth to keep the peace. They'd abandon their position the moment someone pushed back. They'd apologize for having needs, for taking up space, for existing in ways that inconvenienced others. This wasn't gentleness, it was the absence of self. After awakening, the empath discovers something they never had access to before: their own anger. Not reactive rage, not displaced frustration, but clean, clear, boundaried anger that says no and means it. Jung observed that this was often the shadow element empaths had most thoroughly repressed. They'd been taught that anger was dangerous, that good people don't get angry, that spiritual people transcend anger. So they'd buried it so deep that they lost access to the very emotion that protects boundaries. Awakening digs that anger up. And when empaths first make contact with their repressed anger, it can be alarming, both to them and to everyone around them. They may go through a period where they seem harsh, where their no is louder than it needs to be, where they're overcorrecting for decades of being too soft. Jung considered this a necessary phase. The pendulum has to swing before it finds center. The empath who never said no has to practice saying it emphatically before they learn to say it quietly. What eventually stabilizes is a person who can be both soft and fierce, depending on what the moment requires. Jung called this the integration of opposites, and he considered it one of the highest achievements of individuation. The awakened empath hasn't lost their tenderness. They've gained the ability to protect it. They can be compassionate and boundaried, open and discerning, gentle and absolutely immovable when something threatens their integrity. This integrated authority is what makes awakened empaths so unsettling to people who preferred the old version. The old empath could be pushed, the new one cannot. The old empath would explain, justify, and eventually concede. The new one states their position once and doesn't argue. The old empath's kindness could be exploited because it had no backbone. The new empath's kindness is backed by a spine made of everything they survived. The fourth transformation Jung documented was a complete restructuring of how the empath relates to solitude. Before awakening, most empaths feared being alone because solitude meant confronting their own unprocessed inner world. They kept themselves busy with other people's needs, partly to avoid the silence where their own pain lived. Relationships weren't just connections, they were escape routes from the self. After awakening, solitude becomes the empath's sanctuary, not avoidance of people, but genuine nourishment from their own company. Jung found that awakened empaths developed a rich interior life that made isolation not just tolerable, but often preferable to social interaction. They'd discovered that the inner world they'd been running from was actually a source of profound insight, creativity, and peace once the accumulated pain had been processed. This shift is often misread as depression or withdrawal by people who don't understand what's happening. The empath who used to be at every gathering, who was always available for a call, who never turned down an invitation, that person now declines regularly, spends evenings alone by choice, and seems content in a way that confuses people who equate happiness with social activity. But Jung recognized this as the empath finally having a relationship with themselves, the most important relationship they had been neglecting their entire life. The fifth transformation is what Jung found most psychologically significant. He called it the development of the inner witness. Before awakening, empaths were fully merged with their experiences. When they felt something, they became that feeling. When they encountered someone's energy, they were consumed by it. There was no space between the empath and whatever was happening, emotionally, energetically, psychologically. Everything was immediate, overwhelming, total. After awakening, a space develops. Jung described it as the emergence of a consciousness that can observe experience without being identical to it. The awakened empath can feel sadness and simultaneously witness themselves feeling sadness. They can perceive someone's manipulation, while a calm part of their awareness notes the dynamic without being pulled into it. This witnessing capacity doesn't make feelings less real or less felt. It creates a psychological anchor that prevents the empath from being swept away. This inner witness is what gives awakened empaths their characteristic steadiness. They're experiencing everything as intensely as they ever did, maybe more intensely because they're no longer numbing or deflecting, but they're no longer at the mercy of what they experience. There's a center that holds. Jung saw this as the establishment of the self, as the organizing principle of the psyche, replacing the ego's frantic attempts to manage through absorption and accommodation. The combination of these transformations produces a person that Jung found remarkable in clinical observation. The awakened empath retains their extraordinary perceptual abilities, but wields them with discernment. They can read a room, but choose what to engage with. They can sense someone's wound but resist the compulsion to heal it. They can feel deeply but return to their own center afterward. They can be present with suffering without being destroyed by it. Jung noticed something else about these individuals that surprised him. They became natural catalysts for transformation in others, not through effort, not through trying to heal anyone, but through the sheer force of their integrated presence. When someone who has done genuine shadow work sits with you, something shifts. Their refusal to perform, to accommodate falseness, to participate in unconscious dynamics, creates a field where other people's masks become uncomfortable, not because the awakened empath confronts them, but because authenticity makes inauthenticity harder to maintain. This catalytic quality is what Jung considered the awakened empath's true gift, not the old pattern of absorbing everyone's pain and trying to fix them. Something far more powerful and far less exhausting. Just being real, just being whole, just being present without agenda, and letting that presence do whatever work it's going to do in the people who encounter it. But Jung also documented the costs of this transformation because he believed in honesty about difficult truths. The awakened empath loses people. Not everyone can handle the new version. Relationships built on the old dynamic, where the empath gave endlessly and the other person received endlessly, cannot survive the shift. When the empath stops absorbing and starts having boundaries, people who depended on the old system experience it as betrayal. Some will leave. Some will try to guilt the empath back into the old pattern. Some will declare the empath has changed for the worse, has become selfish, has lost their heart. This loss is real and it hurts. Jung didn't minimize it. The awakened empath may find their social circle shrinking dramatically. Family relationships may become strained or severed. Long friendships may end. The empath grieves these losses even as they recognize the relationships were built on dysfunction rather than genuine connection. You can know something was unhealthy and still grieve its ending. Both truths can live in the same heart. What fills the space left by these departures is different from what was there before. Jung observed that awakened empaths eventually attract relationships of a completely different quality. Not relationships built on need and rescue, but relationships built on mutual wholeness. Two people who don't need each other to feel complete, choosing to share their completeness. This is rarer and quieter than the intense dramatic connections empaths are used to. But it's sustainable in ways that trauma bonds and codependent dynamics never were. Jung ultimately saw the awakened empath as evidence of what individuation looks like when it happens to someone with extraordinary perceptual gifts. The abilities don't go away. They mature. The sensitivity doesn't disappear. It gains structure. The depth of feeling doesn't diminish. It finds a container strong enough to hold it. If you're in the middle of this transformation right now, if you're in the phase where everything is falling apart and the person you used to be is dying and you're not sure who you're becoming, Jung would want you to know that what's happening to you is not destruction. It's construction. You're not losing yourself. You're finding yourself for the first time. The person who absorbed everyone else's reality is dissolving so that the person who can finally inhabit their own reality can emerge. That emerging person will not be who you expect. They'll be quieter than you imagined, more boundaried than you thought you were capable of being, more comfortable with solitude than you ever believed possible. They'll feel less, not because they've numbed, but because they've stopped carrying what was never theirs. They'll help less, not because they've become cruel, but because they've stopped confusing self-sacrifice with love. They'll seem harder to people who preferred the soft version, but they'll know, in that deep, unshakable place that awakening creates, that what looks like hardness is actually the first real softness they've ever possessed. Because genuine tenderness requires a self strong enough to offer it freely rather than hemorrhage it compulsively. This is what empaths become after spiritual awakening. Not less, not harder, not cold. They become themselves, fully, unapologetically, for the first time. With all their abilities intact and finally pointed in a direction that serves their life instead of everyone else's. That's the transformation Jung documented. That's what's waiting on the other side of the collapse, and it's worth every terrifying moment of the journey to get there. If you haven't yet, check out our new guide, True Self-Discovery, with 24 practical reflection exercises inspired by the teachings of Carl Jung, designed to help you find your way within. Click below to get true self-discovery.